Yo, and welcome. I didn't like that all. Let's try that again. Yo, and no, that's not it. That's not it. All right, one more. Yo, and welcome. There we go. Just flat, just lifeless delivery. That's what we need here. Yo, and welcome to the KickAss podcast. It's your boy Zack, and I am riding solo dolo this week, and for good reason, because this is one of our, I should say, critically acclaimed, but I can't because I don't think we have done one of these since we switched over from Spotify? No, that's a kind of fishing. Spotify exclusivity to where you're listening to us now, whether that be on Spotify or any of the myriad ways where you can get these here Fairly Kick-Ass podcast episodes. We have not, I do not believe, done an Unsung episode as of yet. So here's how this is going to go. One of us hosts will get in, roll up our sleeves, and take a journey into a person, not necessarily an artist, but a person or people. We actually have had multiple people in the same episode before that were very influential, very important, very pivotal in some part of the landscape of music, but ones that don't necessarily get the recognition that they deserve on a wide scale for the contributions that they made. The ones that we've done before absolutely fall into that arena, and today's episode is not going to be any different. Because we are, oh God, I forgot the music. Oh shit, the music's going to come in. It's going to happen. I can't stop it. Here it is right here. Phew, oh, that was a close one. That was a close one. We almost got musicked, but we got through it, and that's what's important. That's not actually what's important. What's actually important, again, Zack, Fairly Kick-Ass podcast, Unsung, is what we're talking about today, and more specifically, who we're talking about today. Because I'm going to mention a name to all of you, and one of two things are going to come to mind. That name is Steve Albini. You're either going to think, number one, who? Or number two, oh, the Nirvana dude. And yes, we'll get to the Nirvana thing, but there is a lot more to Steve Albini than just the Nirvana dude. And that is what we're going to be talking about today. So kick back, relax, and enjoy this first bit of backstory before we get to the Nirvana bits. Now, this is not a deep dive. You've heard a couple of those already here. Those are more full histories, basically from end to end of the life and times and music, obviously, of an artist. And we're not doing that here with Steve Albini. We're not doing that with the Unsungs. These episodes are more focused on the contributions, more focused on the reasons that these people are unsung in the music industry. But I would be remiss if I didn't at least include a little bit of that history of Steve Albini and kind of what made him him. He was born in Pasadena. When he was about 12 or so, his family moved out to Missoula, Montana, where he found a classmate, friend, what have you, that introduced him to the Ramones. And really, isn't that just the way it always goes, right? Like, I had this friend, they let me listen to such and such artist. I really fell in love with the sound, and I decided that was just the thing that I wanted to do. I feel like a lot of artists would have a very similar path in terms of, kind of how they got into how the desire to be musicians kind of started for them. And Steve's story is no exception there. He played in several local outfits, including one called Just Ducky in the kind of latter part of his teenage years in 1979. Followed by founding the band Big Black in 1981 as a fresh-faced late teens college student at Northwestern. It's probably a great time to mention that this episode and every episode of the Fairly Kick-Ass podcast has a ride-along playlist with relevant, important songs regarding the episode, songs that we talk about, songs that we allude to, honorable mentions, up and down the line, you name it. That playlist is going to be the place to be. And in this episode, it's certainly going to be the place to be because you're going to want to hear all this music. You're going to want to hear the evolution of Albini as a recording engineer. We'll get into the nomenclature here in a minute. And you're going to want to hear just the good music that comes of it, including the track Kerosene from Big Black. and other Big Black tracks as well. Certainly all of them have that kind of very signature, I wouldn't say early necessarily. I think that Steve Albini has always been very faithful to that sound, but maybe raw is a better word for it. Maybe less polished, because of course it is. I mean, he was, just in his early 20s as Big Black was really kind of picking up steam. So yeah, the tracks sound like they were recorded in a factory. Furthermore, they sound like they were recorded with the machines in the factory playing the part of the instruments. It is very, it is very raw, like I said, and it is a journey from front to back, but it is important to really see what makes Steve Albini tick as a musician and also as a recording engineer as well. But, you can start to see kind of those signatures and those hallmarks, whether he's the one playing the instruments or not. You can start to see what that sound is going to shape up to be. You might think that the name Big Black could be poorly connotated, and I haven't gotten specific confirmation one way or another in my research, but guessing from Steve Albini's next band, I'm going to imagine that that is true. There were a couple of tracks in the Big Black discography that Albini was basically vetoed of naming certain songs, very inappropriate names. That's a whole bit that we're going to get into in depth later on in this episode. But suffice it to say that Steve Albini was developing a bit of a penchant, a bit of a reputation for not being the most appropriate dude and just not being a very good dude in a lot of ways. Let's just call a spade, which is why a few years later, his next band had the very unfortunate and terribly named moniker of Rape Man. Apparently, it was named after a similarly terribly named manga series. That doesn't excuse it at all. It doesn't excuse either one, either the manga or the artist or the band name. But again, that is a rather large and important topic that we will dive into here in just a few minutes. But for the sake of the history of Steve Albini, Big Black, and Rape Man, I hate even saying that. Those two bands were essentially the sum total of at least the height of his early musician phase, prior to his phase of becoming a more full-time recording engineer. Not a producer, mind you. And I think that's a very important distinction by Albini's own admission. He always wanted to be known as a recording engineer. There were certain things around the label of producer, and this is another topic we'll actually get into as well, but there were certain connotations around that title that he just didn't want associated with him. So record engineer, not producer. It was a whole thing. You get it. Maybe you don't. I don't know. I don't get it. So producer out, recording engineer in. And whatever you call him, we're going to find out exactly what that meant for him, no matter what you called him, like what exactly did he bring to the table, right? What was the difference between Albini and other record engineers / producers, whatever you want to call them? What set him apart? And I think that we can answer that question somewhat at a higher level. A lot of it, and I know this is a bit of a cop-out, is that you'll know it when you hear it. But I think we can at least quantify that a little bit by just discussing some of his preferences. For one, he, as far as I could tell, was either majority or entirely analog. He had a true disdain for recording with computers. He had a true disdain for digital manipulation of tracks. He wasn't a fan of recording parts separately and then overdubbing them to build the full track. In short, he really wanted and strived to perfectly capture the essence of the work, the essence of the artist. The feel, the vibe, as we would call it today. The most authentic sound of every artist, every instrument, every vocal track that he worked with, he wanted it to be as if you were in the room with the band. And I would say that he achieved that in the vast majority of cases. Whether you think his approach was good or bad, or better or worse than other producers, what can't be disputed is how much care he brought to it. in spite of what was considered and was becoming more and more commonplace for other engineers and producers to go the more digital route. And that's not anything bad or negative to those producers. There are obviously a number of awesome producers that are very digital based. That is the more likely option today. And obviously there are amazing producers today. So that's by no way saying that those producers are worse. It's just different. It's just a difference in the approach. And Albini certainly became a student and eventually a master to his particular approach. But let's get back on track here. So we talked about his time as a musician, and that was really going to be the case until 1988 was kind of the year that it all started to shift from primary musician to primary record engineer. That year had several works. Steve was already working as an engineer for several bands, but there was not a work that really caught on with a large swath of people until Surfer Rosa, the debut album from the Pixies. All throughout the album, if you listen to it, you can hear that signature Albini sound. And you will hear some of that album in the Ride Along playlist as well. But you'll hear that signature engineering sound from Albini without any frills, without any effects, literally as if you were in the front row watching the concert. The following few years would see other albums of note from other notable artists, including the debut albums from artists such as The Breeders and the Jesus Lizard, and the solo debut from once Ministry member Chris Connolly. Also, the following few years would see releases, not debuts, but releases from Hum and Fugazi, Superchunk, Jawbreaker, and PJ Harvey. And that's just a very, very small sampling of what Albini did. Even in those late 80s to early 90s sessions, the man was busy. He had a lot of irons in the fire. He had a lot of artists kind of coming through and really wanting to work with him because of the sound that he produced. But with all those artists and all those albums, there was one that stood out. It's the obvious one. It's the one that I had already talked about earlier in the episode. And this is going to be where we finally connect those dots and talk about Nirvana. So I could sit here and discuss Nirvana, and I'm going to, but I want to make sure to take this time right now to shout out a fellow I say fellow as if we're even in the same universe, Conan O'Brien, late night host, comedian, comedic writer, just amazing talent in everything that he does. If y'all are not familiar with his podcast, Conan O'Brien Needs a Friend, that is absolutely something that you need to get on. It is a fantastic podcast. They have lots of guest hosts that are just amazing individuals. The other hosts with Conan, Sonam Movsesian and Matt Gorley, are also super entertaining, super funny. And great podcast, couldn't say enough good things about it. But there was an episode, and I want to say that this was maybe last year that this episode came out, but it was an episode discussing Nirvana with the remaining members of Nirvana. Dave Grohl, Chris Novoselic, and Steve Albini was also a part of that episode. And it was relevant to the work that Albini did, not the first album from Nirvana, not even the second album, but for the third album, In Utero. Chris was talking about Kurt Cobain's love for Steve's work. And as he was talking about this, he recalled a moment discussing the direction that Kurt wanted to go, kind of departing from the sound of Nevermind, which in and of itself was produced by another legendary producer, Bruce Vigg. But talking about how Kurt was looking to go in a different direction with something a bit less shiny, I guess for lack of a better term, for In Utero. And I'll go ahead and take it straight from Chris here during the episode where he says, quote, "We were cruising in this van, and I think we were listening to Surfer Rosa, and then Kurt was sitting there in the chair, and he raises his finger and makes a decree. He goes, 'This shall be our snare sound.'" Which, first and foremost, can you imagine being a fly on the wall in that van with Chris Novoselic, Dave Grohl, and Steve Albini just shooting the shit? Like that would be the holy grail of, music fandom right there. But I digress. Yeah, Kurt clearly knew Steve's work. He clearly liked what he heard from Steve's work, and he wanted that sound to be a sound that would represent him and his band. And that was that. Steve was brought in to produce In Utero, and it had the Steve Albini sound. I mean, it was undeniable. Dave elaborated a bit later and said of In Utero and other Albini engineered works, he said, quote, "To me, it always sounds really centered, where it's like the vocal isn't jumping ahead of everything else, where things are like riding up and down. It sounds like the sound of a group in a space and really just natural." Let me say that last part again, because I think that was really the best description that I could find of Steve Albini's signature sound, being the sound of a group in a space. A simple concept that Steve mastered at a time when most everyone else was moving in the opposite direction. He doubled down. He decided that this is where I want to be. And he made sure that he wouldn't leave any stone unturned to get to that point. In fact, for In Utero specifically, just listen to Frances Farmer Will Have Her Revenge on Seattle, or Pennyroyal Tea, specifically the album version of Pennyroyal Tea with the full band. I think that if memory serves, the radio version of Pennyroyal Tea that gets a lot of airplay is typically one of the acoustic. I want to say it's maybe from the MTV Unplugged sessions, and it's more acoustic, and it's live, obviously, so it's a different vibe. But specifically the album version, which we will have as a part of our ride-along playlist as well. Compare that, as you listen to it, compare that to the sound of some of the tracks from Nevermind, such as Lithium or Drain You as a couple of good examples. The difference is palpable. Again, not necessarily good or bad, not necessarily better or worse, but just very different. You can hear, just like Dave mentioned, the vocal isn't jumping ahead of everything else. There are parts where the vocal is not drowned out, but just naturally overshadowed in terms of volume, in terms of tone by the instruments, which is what will happen if the band, again, is standing right in front of you and, playing their instruments and singing. Just a very authentic, real representation of what that artist sounds like. I would think if you were to poll 10 Nirvana fans and ask them between In Utero and Nevermind what their favorite album was, and I'm specifying there because Bleach could certainly come up and should come up in that list. It's a great album too. But you're probably going to get a good mixture between those two albums. And that's not because one is better than the other. It's more of, I believe, a preference of sound, of what type of sound folks really prefer between Butch Vig and Steve Albini. But yeah, very interesting to listen to those two albums back to back, to listen to those tracks back to back, and really be able to ascertain how Steve was able to take Kurt's vision and really make it a reality. It was really cool. Post In Utero, the list of artists and albums that Albini worked with was numerous. It was way too numerous to discuss. Just like his earlier work, I don't know that he took vacations. I don't think that time off was a thing that existed for him. By his own estimate, he had worked with several thousand artists. And I am not going to say that that's false, because everything that I can see, everything that I can tell, that's as an accurate representation. Just a quick glance at that discography of acts that he worked with shows a lot of names that you'll recognize. Names such as Veruca Salt and Flogging Molly, Will Oldham of Palace Brothers and Bonnie Prince Billy fame, Godspeed You Black Emperor, Gogol Bordello, and Foxy Shazam, as well as the second Jimmy Page and Robert Plant album, Walking into Clarksdale, just as the cherry on top. I'll throw a few examples from some of those and some other ones into the ride-along playlist, making sure to highlight his discography from the 1990s all the way up to earlier this year. And even throughout all of that time, he still found the time to be a member of his Definitely his band with the most longevity. I would say arguably his most popular band, which was Shellac. He was able to release 6 albums from 1994's Ad Action Park to Two All Trains, which was released earlier this year. Again, with a full slate of work that he was working on the entire time. How he did it, how he found the time to even do the production work, the recording engineering work. See, I did it too. Much less be a member of a band and release albums is beyond me. I had mentioned the album To All Trains, which released in May of this year. Sadly, that was a posthumous release, coming 10 days after the passing of Steve Albini, who died at home from a heart attack on May 7th of 2024. To call what he left behind a legacy is a hell of an understatement. The tendrils of his work that I, sat here and went over and barely scratched the surface of in the course of, 20, 30 minutes or so. It would take hours. It would take days to really cover every single stitch. Not only just directly of the work that he did, but also the far-reaching impacts of that work above and beyond just the albums themselves. Whether due to a love of the music or a deeper appreciation of how that music came to be, either way, my guess is that all of you have really vibed to music that he was responsible for at some point in the past, even outside of the Nirvana work. Even if we take In Utero out of the picture altogether, I would venture to guess that each and every one of you has intersected with a Steve Albini work and have not realized that he was responsible for it. And if I had to guess, he would consider that a victory. So I'll end with this bit because I feel like it's important to cover, even if it's not directly related to the music itself. As I kind of alluded to earlier, Steve Albini was not someone who was without controversy. He had a number of bad, offensive, and downright harmful takes, to be totally honest. Some of those takes revolved around the music industry in general, specifically the exploitation of artists, the difficulty for artists to make a good living in the then current, and let's be real, the current landscape, and several other ones as well. I think those are fine. I think those are warranted. I think those, for the most part, I agree with those takes. I think that the way that he viewed the music industry as not being a bastion of good and justness and fairness for the artist and being what it is, just a slice of money-hungry capitalism, I think that was spot on. What I'm more referring to as being bad, offensive, and downright harmful were his other takes. If you're familiar with the term edgelord, that's basically what Steve Albini was in a nutshell. Had very transgressive thoughts and feelings and exclamations, said the most heinous and out there and just terrible shit. But it was because of how ironic it was. With like the thought process being like, oh, it's dumb for someone to feel this very terrible and offensive way that I'm portraying with the terrible things coming out of my mouth right now, or the terrible things coming off of my pen. And or it's dumb for folks to be offended by people who think and, say these terrible words and these terrible things. So it's okay to do. I'm proving a point. This is Steve talking, not me talking. Even though it is something that I will readily admit that I also came to terms with as a young dude. It did take Albini a bit longer than me. I've kind of put the pieces together in my late teens and early 20s and figured out where I wanted to be, and it wasn't in that space at all. So I quickly learned and grew and moved away from it. It took Steve well into the 2000s before he was able to make those same changes. But you could start to see, especially in the early 2020s, some of those changes, some of that growth, some of that evolution really starting to happen. It's something that was evident from a tweet in April of 2023, and not the first time he's tweeted out about how shitty of a human he was in these ways. but it was just very telling as he tweeted, quote, "Life is hard on everybody, and there's no excuse for making it harder. I've got the easiest job on earth. I'm a straight white dude. Fuck me if I can't make space for everybody else." None of that, none of his changes or evolution or growth or anything else takes away his previous thoughts, takes away the harm that they might have done, doesn't excuse it in any way. But it is always awesome to see that people, no matter how prolific, no matter how much in the public eye, no matter how well they're known for a thing, or no matter what kind of legacy they would leave behind, it still is awesome to see that people have the capacity to change and grow and improve as humans. And for all of the amazing works and amazing albums that Steve Albini engineered, for all the amazing artists he worked with, I feel like this is the single greatest feat that he was able to accomplish. So with that, we come to the end of our Unsung episode. I hope that all of you were able to learn a bit more about Steve Albini. I certainly learned a ton that I was not aware of. I think that it is important to shine the spotlight on folks like that don't usually get the spotlight. Someone who was so influential, someone who is able to be spoken of in terms of the music that he was responsible for in one way or another, with such a reverence, with such a sort of positivity, with folks being able to say that, yeah, this is a signature sound because this dude made it happen, because Steve Albini made sure that that was going to be the way it was, and he was unrelenting in that. If you liked what you heard, we do have other unsung episodes in our Spotify exclusivity. We call it The Vault because it's only available on Spotify right now. So go search for Fairly KickAss on Spotify if you want to hear some of those older unsung episodes. We are slowly bringing things over. We've only done deep dives as of yet. We'll probably start to bring over some of the older unsung episodes, some other episode types as well. So be on the lookout for those. You'll see them as either Fairly KickAss Vault episodes or Fairly KickAss Rewind episodes. Check out all of our previous vaulted work, all of the work that we've done post Spotify exclusivity. You can find us wherever you get your podcast. Just search for Fairly KickAss. If you want to hit us up on the socials to talk about this episode, to talk about any episode, to talk about whatever's on your mind, what'd you have for breakfast this morning? We will gladly take any and all comments, concerns, discussions, profanities, whatever you got. It's going to be at Fairly KickAss in all of 4 places, that being Instagram, TikTok, Threads, and Twitter. FairlyKickAss.com is the source for all of the ride-along playlists. As I alluded to before, this is going to be a fairly large ride-along playlist because there's just so much music. But let us know what you think about the playlist, about the selection of songs. If there are any songs or albums or artists that you know of that Steve worked with that you would also add to the list, let us know that too. Our email address is fairlykickass@gmail.com. Again, Fairly KickAss, wherever you get your podcasts, you will find us. And until the next time we meet, I hope that each and every one of you keeps kicking ass.